What is going on, gunfighters? Did that sound get you excited? I'm just wondering. I was just doing a dry fire session for the day and doing a little bit of speed draw. I just thought that'd be a familiar sound to anybody that's done any kind of like really serious shooting. That timer going off, kind of setting you free, letting you grab that gun and go to work. Anyway, what are we going to talk about today on this episode? I thought it was about time that we talk about the FN S.C.A.R. 16 and the 17. A little bit of history, a little bit of background, a little bit of mechanical function, a little bit of what they're great for, what they're good for, what they're maybe not good for. So, today, a chat on the S.C.A.R. So saddle up for Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, firearms, ammunition, tactics, ballistics, all kinds of different subjects, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. With that, I'm going to put in a quick bio, and then we'll get into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also, law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Melito, and I am blessed to serve you today. So, to set a background, we've used the AR-15, M16, and then started moving towards the M4, which is kind of a shorter, handier version of that. Well, that system was designed with a 20-inch barrel and a rifle-length gas system. It only stands to reason that when you shorten that, you get hotter gases, higher pressures, and that may cause some issues. For whatever reasons, in the early 2000s, and if you'll recall, we had been at war a few years, September 11th, 2001, and then shortly thereafter, the War on Terror, or Global War on Terror, whatever you want to call it, was in full swing. I myself was over there fighting in the early 2000s. And in these early 2000s, I believe 2004, U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM. And for whatever reason, they were unhappy with their current weapons, and they decided to go with a S.C.A.R. 17 and 16. Now, you can go look that up. It's kind of a fascinating, in-the-weeds study of these rifle trials and everything that went into that, and controversies with the M4 that I don't really want to accuse if I can't back it up, and there's so much conflicting information out there. If you want to wade into that pond on your own, it is kind of interesting. But that is not what we're here to talk about today. Today, we're here to talk about the S.C.A.R. specifically. However, it got adopted in the, early mid-2000s. It did. And it kind of became a thing. It may have existed prior to that, but that's kind of when it became this kind of sought-after battle rifle, assault rifle, fighting rifle, whatever you want to call it, whether you're talking about the 5.56 version, the S.C.A.R. 16, or the 7.62 NATO, the S.C.A.R. 17, the S.C.A.R. Light, and the S.C.A.R. Heavy versions. Either way, they made this kind of a thing, and a thing that people wanted, and a thing that people kind of sought after, the S.C.A.R. And the S.C.A.R., I should mention, stands for Special Operation Forces Combat Assault Rifle. Now, we talked about the M16, AR-15, M4, and it's kind of hard not to. when talking about this weapon. There's been a lot of iterations over the years, from the original AR-10 to the AR-15 to the M16A1, A2, A4, the M4, the M4A1. There's been a lot of tweaking of that system over 68-ish years ago. If you think about that, this was pre the 1957 Chevy. This was back in the 50s. Coca-Cola was in glass bottles. According to some quick research, a loaf of bread cost around 18 cents. Just to give you an idea, and this rifle came about. And again, not to get too political, but I will point out this, scary black rifle was invented over 60 years ago. It's not new, and it's not new in America for sure. So I don't see how it can be blamed for a lot of the problems we're in as far as criminal activity goes. Anyway, that's a brief aside. They tweaked the system. It's not my favorite system, but they did a lot to it to improve it and get it running as good as they can. But I guess at some point they opened the door to look at different systems. Now, the AR-15 M16 is commonly referred to as direct impingement, and I know from a strict engineering standpoint it is not. I know that technically the bolt was kind of its own gas piston, but for all practical purposes we know it as, and it's commonly referred to as direct impingement. A system by which some gas is bled off of the barrel and travels down a small gas tube that rests on the snorkel on the bolt carrier, and that hot gas shoves that bolt back and forth, unlocks the bolt, allowing pressures to drop to a safe level, and it shoves that bolt back using that gas. Pretty cool system. The issue is that dirty gas, because that gas is not clean. If you've ever cleaned a gun barrel, you know how dirty they can get. That dirty gas is being ventilated, expelled in the operating system of the gun, the bolt carrier group, the receiver, the kind of main working parts of that gun. They're receiving that dirt and debris. And some would argue that it's a self-cleaning system. I'm not here to rag on that system, but anybody that's ever cleaned an AR-15 or an M16 bolt knows very clearly that they don't stay very clean. The fact that there are carbon scraping tools to scrape carbon off of parts of that gun should tell you that they don't stay that clean. And I think at the heart of it, people, SOCOM, whomever, they maybe we're looking for a different solution, a better solution. And again, go look at those rifle trials if you like. But however it got adopted, the S.C.A.R came into being. And it was never really mass adopted. Obviously, it did not replace the M16, M4, because I think largely due to cost, and the military already had it. And part of the reason for the M4 when they went to it was they wanted a lot of parts compatibility. And in fact, the vast majority of the parts, I believe, do interchange between the M16s and the M4s. And so they kind of stuck with that, I think, mostly due to cost. I would argue that of all the money we spend in defense in the U.S. military, the infantry's fighting rifle probably isn't a place that I personally would want to cut corners, speaking as somebody that was infantry in the Marine Corps. Right? That rifleman and his rifle. I don't think that's a place to cut corners or save costs, but I think that is a major reason we didn't see mass adoption of something else. Again, we've had this rifle for a long time. And although just thinking about it briefly and ironically, we fought many wars with it, but I think the only one you could argue that we won with it was Desert Storm. It's a much smaller war as far as timeline and duration go, not to take anything away from those veterans, than Vietnam or the War on Terror. But all the other wars I think that we fought with the M16, we've lost. But for whatever reason we want to stick with it, or at least until recently, but not everybody was happy with it. So the S.C.A.R 16, S.C.A.R 17 comes into being. All that to say, it doesn't have that system. It doesn't use that gas tube it doesn't, now some gas, some dirt and stuff is going to get into the action, but it doesn't intentionally funnel hot, dirty gas into the bolt and bolt carrier group. It uses a gas piston system. To be particular, a short stroke gas piston system. And without getting crazy nerdy, that's kind of been hashed out as a better system. That same gas is bled off the barrel, but instead of getting cycled back into the action, it punches a piston which works the action, and that hot gas gets expelled outside of the rifle largely. And that kind of is the heart of the S.C.A.R system. So that's the big notable difference, I think, for anybody that's familiar with the AR-15 M16, and I assume if you're listening to this that you are. It is a completely different operating system. They, I think, have more in common aesthetically and ergonomically. I think they wanted to keep that because, again, we've been using it for so long, decades and decades, that most American servicemen are familiar with the controls and everything of the AR-15 type rifle. So that's something they wanted to keep. The smaller version, the 16, will even use the same magazines. But it's more similar in ergonomics and controls than it is in actual form and function, in my opinion. The internals are very different. Another big notable difference in the S.C.A.R and the AR type weapons is the serialized part. For AR-15s, M16s, for most Americans, you know that it's the strip lower. That's a serialized part, that piece of aluminum, that block of aluminum that really doesn't have a lot to do with the function of the weapon other than it houses the trigger mechanism. That's why we can so easily and affordably make our own AR-15s, because we can machine out that part pretty easily, and then the rest of it is not serialized, so we can just buy it. The S.C.A.R is kind of different in that way. The serialized part of the S.C.A.R is the upper receiver. Now, both have upper and lower receivers, but they're kind of flip-flop in that in the S.C.A.R, the upper part is much more substantial, and it houses a big, beefy bolt carrier group, and that is the serialized part of the firearm. For whatever reason, when they were choosing a serialized part, that's the part they went with. I do believe the S.C.A.Rs come standard with a cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel, which has kind of been known for a long time as the gold standard in barrels. Some would argue that other things are better, but nobody really argues with the proven dependability and quality of a cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel. I think chrome lining is really, really important in a fighting weapon. I've seen it enough. Chrome lining is not a gimmick. It actually does work. It stops corrosion. It's a slick surface. If there's one thing you don't want corroding in your combat weapon, it is the inside of the chamber and the inside of the barrel. I would rather have my rifle have a lot of external corrosion and look horrible and have clean, smooth running internals than vice versa. That cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel, I think, is a fantastic thing. I think FN is known for making good quality barrels, and they have been for a long time. They also boast a bolt carrier group that's quite a bit different in appearance, although the bolt itself, the locking lug bolt system, looks quite similar to what you'd be familiar with an AR-15 pattern and those multi-rotating lugs. Because of the way the AR-15 is designed, you're probably familiar with the buffer and buffer tube system. This has got a couple of unintended consequences, I would say. From somebody that grew up shooting long before he picked up an M16, it's a very foreign kind of feel shooting that as opposed to any other weapon, because the height over bore is so high. Because that buffer tube has to move straight back in line with the bolt, you have to put your sights up pretty high. And that height over bore has some advantages and some disadvantages. I would say overall, for me, it's a disadvantage. I don't like it. And that's just one of those things like the direct impingement system. That buffer tube is kind of this thing that you can only do so much with. You can make it a little bit shorter. They've made ones that make it fold. But the issue is when you fold them, you can't fire them like that. The S.C.A.R has no such issue because it does not have a buffer tube system. Its springs are also housed, the main spring, the main recoil spring, whatever you want to call it. I don't know the technical name for it, but that main spring is actually in the upper receiver. So you can fold the stock and unfold the stock, and you can fire that weapon with the stock folded or the stock unfolded. Now, why is that important? Well, for a lot of things, vehicle operations, convoys, things like that, it can be quite handy. Have a small handy weapon. And in general, you're probably not going to fire the weapon with the stock folded. It's just not very accurate. However, the ability to do so could be important, and I like that aspect of the S.C.A.R. Also, we talked about that buffer tube. Since it doesn't have one, I think it has a much more, although not traditional looking, traditional feeling stock. It shoulders more like a fine sporting shotgun or a good, well-pointing sporting rifle than the M16 AR-15, which again just kind of feels foreign. If that's all you've ever done or all you've ever really shot, then I guess that would be your baseline normal. But it's far different than many other weapons because of that buffer tube, and the height and your cheek and your face have to be so high above the general body of that weapon. The S.C.A.R, again, doesn't have that problem, so it has a traditional swept down stock that you'll see on almost any other traditional firearm. And again, the stock doesn't look traditional. It doesn't look like a hunting rifle stock or a sporting shotgun stock, but it feels much more like that when you throw it into your shoulder than the M16 AR-15 does. That's another big difference. Since the AR-15, M16 came in an era when optical sights were not the norm, it originally wasn't really equipped for that. It had the carry handle, and they had some early apparatuses to affix optics to carry handles and attach other things, and aftermarket quad rails and things. But since the S.C.A.R came in the early aughts, it came in that era. It comes already with a flat top 1913 rail system and accessory rails. You don't have to do a bunch of workarounds to mount good modern optics or accessories because it uses that 1913 rail and it comes with it. And it was designed like that. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't a, hey, how can we modify this weapon from the 1950s to make it more modern? It's, let's get started with a modern platform. We want it right out of the gate to accept optics because we see that that's kind of the way we should do things. You know, good optics are a force multiplier. Also, we want the ability to mount stuff like a white light or any other special things that you might want to mount on a rifle. Now, I've mentioned the S.C.A.R 16 and 17 as if those are the only models. There are many variants of this. For the basic model, though, the S.C.A.R Heavy, which is not really aptly named. I mean, it is more firepower, but it's not a heavy gun. For a full-sized 308 7.62 NATO fighting rifle, it comes in at 7.9 pounds. That's a great weight for a fighting rifle. The S.C.A.R Light M556 comes in at 7.3 pounds. So these are pretty good as far as weight goes. There also, I should mention, is a S.C.A.R 15 variant, which is kind of a small CQB weapon, which would be really cool and handy if it wasn't for, you know, the fact that here in America, if we don't have a 16-inch barrel on a rifle, we either have to get a tax stamp or leave it without a stock, which, you know, firing a rifle without a stock, not the best. It can be done, but it's not great. But that variant does exist, the S.C.A.R 15, which is a very short, compact, kind of CQB version of the S.C.A.R 16. They do also apparently make a smaller version, the CQB type weapon in the S.C.A.R Heavy as well. The S.C.A.R HCQC. And a longer barrel of the S.C.A.R Heavy, I presume for designated marksman roles, the S.C.A.R HLB. And the S.C.A.R HPR precision rifle. which has a 2-stage match trigger according to the Wikipedia that I'm looking at. Now, I must mention that the S.C.A.Rs don't have the best trigger, and I guess that's a pretty good segue. But they don't have the best trigger. They have a trigger on par with most other military-issue fighting rifles, like the military M4s, M16s. The trigger pulls on those are pretty bad as far as rifle standards go. Now, I did qualify expert in the Marine Corps with an old beat-up M16A2. So you can work around those triggers, but they are not good. It's kind of like a Glock trigger. Like you can be a good shooter and shoot well with them, but they're always kind of a handicap. And the S.C.A.R is no different. It's made as a fighting rifle. It doesn't have the best trigger out of the box. Which I guess brings us to some of the benefits, or not so much benefit, brought to the table by the S.C.A.R system. One of the big downsides of the S.C.A.R, whether it's the S.C.A.R little or the S.C.A.R big, the light or the heavy, they're expensive. They're expensive weapons. You know, many times what a good AR is going to cost you, not the cheapest bottom of the barrel AR, but even a good AR, you could buy a couple to a few of those for the cost of a S.C.A.R 16 or 17. Now, you can certainly go Gucci and get super high-end ARs that will cost every bit as much, but in general, a good quality AR is going to be several times cheaper usually than the S.C.A.R system. Also, not only that, since the AR M16 family has been with us so long, there's so many aftermarket parts and support. You can get a new bolt carrier group. You can get, nickel plated, titanium nitride plated. You can get a Make It Rain dust cover if that's your thing, right? But you can get on any number of websites and order all kinds of stuff for your AR. The S.C.A.R 16-17, except for the magazines in the S.C.A.R 16 being the same, largely proprietary. So that's a big downside. Cost and the incompatibility with other weapon systems. It's its own thing. It's not an AR-15. It's not an AR-10. It's not really compatible with other systems. Yeah, I mean the optics and stuff, different mounts, but because of that height over bore issue we talked about. But yeah, a good optic will work on both. But for a lot of the accessories and parts, you're talking a different ballpark than you are with an AR-15 pattern. Which begs the question, why? Why are you going to spend more money and get less compatibility? Well, I think the big one is, as we discussed, the operating system. I think it is a better operating system. And although you can certainly polish that old warhorse, the M4, the M16, and do all kinds of workarounds to make that system more reliable, you could just start off with in my opinion, better operating system in the short stroke gas piston. So that's kind of what you're paying for. So if you go that route, it's a really well made, thought out, and proven short stroke gas piston system. FN thus far has made really good quality S.C.A.Rs. I think there is some thing to be said for that, knowing that if you buy from this manufacturer, this weapon, you could have a lemon in any group. You could have a lemon in a Glock 19 or a Glock 17, but you have a pretty high expectation of good quality in that FN S.C.A.R. So that's something. Also, use in adverse conditions. Not only is that short stroke gas piston system good as far as making itself dirty less than the AR, I think it has a lot of advantages in other environments. One where you're not necessarily going to be able to maintain it all the time. The AR-15 M16 is a pretty high maintenance weapon. It is about as high maintenance a fighting weapon system that I'm aware of, that I've ever used. I can clean generally several other guns in the amount of time it takes to properly clean, like as far as like a Marine Corps armory inspection would go, M16, AR-15. It's a dirty system. It's hard to clean all the way. It's pretty high maintenance as far as that goes. If you want to keep your gun clean, you could just let it be dirty and run it until it quits. But I think it's a lot more high maintenance than that S.C.A.R system is. Also, if you don't want that giant height over bore issue and you want a good folding stock right from the gate, you don't have to get some workaround and spend a bunch of money and then you can fold the stock, but you can't shoot it like that. The S.C.A.R eliminates that whole buffer tube system, which was kind of a cool idea, but I don't really like it. And if I can get rid of it, I'd like to get rid of it, and the S.C.A.R does that. And I guess I'll close telling a story about my S.C.A.R 17. So, if you listen to the bio, veteran, law enforcement veteran, and for a lot of that I ran other fighting rifles. I'm familiar with many other fighting rifles. The M14, the M16s, the A2, the A4 had a S.C.A.R, I don't know the exact designation when I was a law enforcement, a S.C.A.R 15 or the XM experimental version of that. It was full auto, it was a carbine, it was really a good gun. I'm familiar with those, the M4s, private contracting, familiar with those. Also, in law enforcement, had access to a lot of other weapons that you might not think of, but a Mini 14, which is not a bad weapon. But let's just say I had quite a bit of experience with fighting firearms. And when I was the commander of a tactical team, I was blessed to be a part of that. God blessed me to be a part of that and to be the commander to not only lead them in the field, but I was kind of the administrator too. I wrote policies, I wrote firearms policies, equipment, gear, permissible, not permissible, all those kind of things. And I liked guys to run what they wanted to run. And when it got to me, I thought, well, if our primary job is to stop active shooters as this tactical team, what rifle do I want for that job? And I don't know what this exact scenario is going to be. It could be many different scenarios. I could be in a designated marksman role. I could be doing CQB. Whatever the job is, by God's grace and provision and strength, got to get it done. I decided to get a S.C.A.R 17, a S.C.A.R Heavy, the 308 version. I think that's a very versatile round. I like the round for a lot of things. Again, I didn't know what I was going to be doing. Maybe designated marksman, maybe CQB, maybe stopping a vehicle ramming. Those are a real threat too. And that S.C.A.R Heavy version, that S.C.A.R 308 version, that's under 8 pounds for a full-size, semi-automatic fighting rifle. Right away, I was very happy with the quality. The accuracy was crazy accurate. I mean, if it was a precision bolt gun, I would be happy with the accuracy. It's a phenomenally accurate gun. Now, sample size of 1, I don't know if they're all that accurate, but mine certainly is. The one thing I was kind of disappointed in, the trigger, again, as I mentioned, it's not great. And again, it's kind of a proprietary thing, so you can get a lot of really good AR triggers for not that much money, but I'd say more than double the cost of a common good AR trigger for a good S.C.A.R 17 trigger. But once that trigger upgrade was done, it let me shoot the weapon more accurately. It's a great, great firearm. Mine has that trigger, it has a sling. If I'm using it as my go-to fighting rifle, it should have a white light. And mine is mounted with a Trigicon AccuPoint. Tritium fiber optic, no batteries. Good optic. And that was one of my go-to fighting rifles as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. So if my life and my men's lives and the community at large, the old lady, the little kid, their lives depend on me doing a good job. I wanted a good tool, and I think the S.C.A.R is that. If this is any kind of endorsement, if that post-apocalyptic scenario happens and I can only have one rifle. Now, if I could only have one gun, it wouldn't be a rifle. It'd be a shotgun. I've said that many times. However, if you said you got to pick one rifle it would be my S.C.A.R 17. I could think of no other rifle on this planet that I'd rather have. And that's a pretty good endorsement from me. If I could only have one rifle, I would have my S.C.A.R 17 to do any number of things. Now that would change if you gave me a specific role, where a more specific rifle would make more sense. But in a general scenario, if I could only have one rifle, I think S.C.A.R 17, I really can't think of anything that beats it. Tactical tip of the day is not going to have to do with the S.C.A.R, it's going to have to do with the AR-15 family. Now, I think the general go-to finish for bolts and things like that for the military is phosphate. I think that finish leaves a lot to be desired. I think you can do better. I think the original design was with a chrome-lined bolt, and I don't know if it was for price or whatever reason, they went with the phosphate. But I think a chrome-lined bolt, a tin bolt, or a nitride bolt. Nitride is a pretty awesome finish. If you can look at one of those other finishes, if you're a high-volume shooter, if you're just a hobbyist shooter, or you just take your AR out once or twice a year, shoot a couple of rounds to it, really don't worry about it. But if you're a high-volume shooter, competitive shooter, you're going to trust your life to this weapon, other than like home defense where you might fire a couple of rounds. You might really look at some upgraded finishes, especially on that bolt carrier, because, well, for a lot of reasons, that's one of the high-stress parts, and a part that, because of that design we talked about, really accumulates dirt. And I guess my two recommendations would be chrome lining or nitride, either one. So you might really look at that. Again, if you have a heavy volume use AR-15 M4 type weapon. Your tactical verse of the day. I know as gun guys, we can often get wrapped around the axle. We're just talking about bolt finishes. If it's a legit fighting tool, I think have a good one. But as Jesus says, the abundance of a man's life does not consist in the things that he possesses. This verse, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses. Naked you came into this world, and naked you're going out of this world. So, as much as we might think about guns and barrels and bolt carriers and direct impingement versus a piston system or whatever, don't lose sight of what's really important. And that's God. Keep him at the center. He, not the next shiny gun. God is the key to an abundant life. Let's remember that. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.